Hi, my name is Jonathan Dallymore, and I'd like to help you think about how you might prepare and revise for the HSC Modern History exam, and in particular, the core section dealing with Allied victory in the First World War and the skill of using your own knowledge and sources to respond to a question. There'll be two videos that actually do this. The first will concentrate on building your own knowledge and the second on actually responding to the questions. And they're both linked to a journal article from Teaching History in September 2016, which have some general tips on how to go about this, have some sample sources that you could use, and also have sample questions that you could use to prepare for the exam. So let's begin to think about how you might build your own knowledge to explain Allied victory in the First World War. One thing I think it's helpful to do is think about maybe three broad themes that you could use to explain why it was the Allies and not the Central Powers who actually won the war. The first theme that I tend to emphasise in trying to explain this issue is the structural advantages that the Allied powers had. In his book, Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, Paul Kennedy points out that in 1914 the Allied powers actually had a 2-to-1 manpower advantage over the Central Powers. It's also important, I think, to point out here that particularly once the United States committed to this war, the Allied powers had a massive advantage over the Central Powers. If you think about generally the productive capacity of the United States, this is one thing that they contributed, but also, again, in terms of manpower, they were pouring 250,000 soldiers onto the Western Front every month by 1918. The second theme that I tend to emphasise here is the economic and political war that was waged by the Allied powers, and this in general was probably more effective than the Central Powers. So, for example, from the beginning of the war, the Allied powers implemented a very effective naval blockade of Germany, which seriously disrupted German imports, things like rubber and tin. Also, you need to probably think here about the strength of Allied propaganda, and in particular, the Allies' ability to target neutral powers like the United States in the early parts of the war. And thirdly, I think it's important to emphasise that the Allied powers were able to maintain a far better coalition effort in the war than were the Central Powers. So when the Americans joined the war in 1917-1918, they immediately contribute their navies to the war effort and the blockade in particular. And also the Allied powers come together in 1918 and agree to appoint a supreme commander on the Western Front, the French General Ferdinand Foch. The third major theme that I think is important to emphasise in explaining Allied victory is the events on the battlefields themselves, and perhaps particularly on the Western Front. So in March 1918, we know that the Germans launched the spring offensives, and these were initially very, very successful, but actually quickly ran their course. And in the process, the Germans actually took on about 1 million casualties, which is hugely costly to them in 1918. And if we consider those structural advantages we talked about briefly before, these casualties are very hard to replace. The second point that I'd emphasise here is the success of the Allied powers in the 100 Days offensives or their counter-offensives against the Germans on the Western Front in 1918. So in this case, it's pretty clear that the British, particularly the British Army, but also the French, have developed a fairly effective way of fighting the Germans. So Robin Pryor talks about this in terms of the British developing a very effective weapons system against the Germans. And they deploy this at numerous places, but in particular the Battle of Amiens, where they turn around the German spring offensives, and also at St. Quentin, where they actually break convincingly the German Hindenburg Line, which was the most important defensive positions that the Germans had on the entire Western Front. So that's not the only way you could explain Allied victory in the First World War, but I think it is a helpful start. You've got three major themes that you can take into the exam, ready to discuss those issues with some specific factual information underneath each of them. If you'd like to develop your knowledge of this a bit further, I'd suggest you go and have a look at the relevant chapters from Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, where he discusses some of those structural advantages in a fair bit of detail. And the second book that I think you should have a look at is a book called 1918 Year of Victory by Ashley Eakins. And in particular, I'd suggest you have a look at Robin Pryor's chapter, which is called Stabbed in the Front, in which he really discusses in some detail the ability of the Allied powers to overcome Germany on the Western Front in 1918.